Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Thursday the 19th, where we are talking about short stories, specifically A Sorrowful Woman, The Story of an Hour, and A Rose for Emily. So, talking a little bit about A Sorrowful Woman, very different from A Secret Sorrow. And A Secret Sorrow, that chapter from a Harlequin romance, would be our example of something that's very formulaic, that is very predictable, that is very superficial. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with those things if you want escapism or entertainment. But the reality is that the kinds of literature that we are going to be studying in class, and we are studying in class, have some depth and sophistication. They could, of course, also have elements of entertainment associated with them. But I think you'll see that A Sorrowful Woman is a very different kind of piece than A Secret Sorrow. Written by Gail Godwin, female, and paying attention to the author is always important because that can give you some information about the story. Though we need to be cautious and make sure that we aren't necessarily assuming that an author's biography will transfer over to their particular writing, and they might be inspired by it, but of course they are ultimately writing fiction. But Gail Godwin, a female author, PhD in English, known for her feminist writings, makes a lot of sense when we think about the subject matter of A Sorrowful Woman that was published in 1971. And that too, we want to pay attention to dates because we want to make sure that we have an understanding of the time period. Sometimes we might be given a date with the letter B in front of it. B means born, so that would be the author's birth. So, what we want to make sure is that we're getting the actual date of publication. If you know anything about the 1960s and the early 1970s, it was a very tumultuous time. And to oversimplify, there were movements such as the civil rights movement and, for our purposes, the women's rights movement that seemed to be important in terms of our understanding of this particular text. What happens when society has an expectation for an individual, and that individual, for whatever reason, doesn't want or cannot fit into that expectation? In other words, once upon a time, there was a wife and mother one too many times, which is the opening line of the piece before we actually even get to the story. And we may not necessarily understand that line until we get to the ending of the piece. And in fact, we might need to reread the piece multiple times to truly get a sense as to what is happening. But of course, we know that what is happening is less important than why those things are happening. So we're told from the very beginning through the title, and paying attention to titles is very important, that one of the things we will be examining in this story is what a woman does when she feels sorrowful, hence the title, A Sorrowful Woman. And I would argue the A, the article A, is more important than perhaps any other element in the title, because if it were the sorrowful woman, it would point to a specific person. But a sorrowful woman suggests one of many. And it doesn't necessarily mean everyone, but it means more than one. And the fact that we have characters who are unnamed seems to support that idea that they don't have individual identities, so they can't be reduced to a specific person. What they are reduced to are their roles. And what happens when individuality is lost because of role as wife or mother? A fascinating story, I've often said, would be to hear about a sorrowful man and get the piece from his perspective. A sorrowful child, get the piece from the child's perspective. A sorrowful family, and get the child from their perspective. But the author made a very deliberate decision that she wanted to focus on the female, and specifically what it means for female to be wife and mother when that occurs just one too many times. And the idea here is that it isn't necessarily that this person has been married before, been a mother before. There's no evidence in the text to support that. But what there is evidence in the text to support is that this woman's journey is representational. And the idea that we start in the winter evening, and oftentimes the seasons are used in literature to denote, let's say, psychological states, or to denote particular time periods in life. So the winter is oftentimes associated with something negative and gloomy. Of course, you might enjoy the winter very much so, but nevertheless, when we think about winter, we oftentimes think about descent, think about what happens in the natural world, where this is where plants have died, for instance. And the idea of the winter being very cold and isolating seems to reinforce some of the themes in the text. And if we were to take this a step further and use the seasons or even the times of day to represent different life stages. Morning could be the beginning of life, daytime could be the height of life, adulthood, evening could be the descent of life, and then ultimately nighttime or midnight, let's say, could be the ending of a life. And the same thing in terms of the seasons, where spring would be rebirth and renewal, the height of life, or the beginning of life. Summer would be the height of life. Fall would be the beginning of descent, the beginning of falling, basically. And then finally, winter would be descent. And all of that um, association with winter and evening seems to be particularly applicable for the tone of this piece. And repeatedly, we're told that the husband understands. If something is repeated in a text, it's probably important. And of course, the one of the central questions is, does he? And that, yes, he certainly seems to be supportive, but the idea of what the woman needs is very different than the kind of support the husband is able to give. And this is not necessarily to place blame on any of these characters. Again, think about the time period where there was very little psychological understanding about things like PTSD, which is oftentimes referenced in this particular text. That could this be an element of PTSD? Could this be an element of seasonal affective disorder? Could this be an element of postpartum depression? Sure, all those things are possible, but the reality is that the author wants us to focus on the specifics of what it means to be a wife and a mother in the late 60s, early 70s, when one is not really suited for that particular role. And she needs a lot more than breakfast in bed, which is something that the husband is offering her. And the reality is she needs more than sleeping medication. In fact, the husband merely not only enables her behavior, but offers her basically opportunity and means to commit her ultimate suicide at the ending of the text. We are given lots of color imagery in this text, so you might want to pay attention to the use of color. Again, the author would make a very deliberate decision, especially in a short story that is so short, that focuses on a single incident, usually. I don't necessarily have a formula to determine what is short and what is a novel. I can't give you a page number, for instance. I suppose you know it when you see it. But again, usually we think of the idea of a short story talking about a particular incident as opposed to something like a novel that might have multiple incidents within it, plots and subplots. And we do have a middle ground, something called a novella, something that's longer than a short story, but that is shorter than a novel. But more on that in a minute. But in this short story, we're given color imagery such as gray, which seems to reinforce what we've been talking about in terms of winter and evening and setting the tone. That the child's eyes are gray, the husband's shirt is gray, as they are at the beginning of the piece watching the woman perform her expected duties. And there's an episode with a bra where the husband is beginning to undress her. If this were a piece of formula fiction, it would be the beginning of an erotic episode. But this is not a piece of formula fiction. The bra is symbolic. If you know anything about the 1970s and the women's rights movements, you will know that women were literally burning their bras in protest of repression and suppression, which is what a bra could represent. It's terribly uncomfortable, it's confining. But however, a bra can also offer support. And this might be another way of viewing this text. This is a woman who's looking for support. And of course, the bra is oftentimes viewed as an erotic article of clothing for female. And of course, that is not the direction in which this story is headed. We're told at the very beginning that the woman wants instant sleep. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. That's a clue of what's going to be important later on in the story, but we don't necessarily know that's a clue. It's one of the reasons why we have to reread, which is what really a piece of literature demands of you. A Secret Sorrow and the story of Faye and Kai can be read once, and basically you've got the major elements there. But a story like this one, A Sorrowful Woman, in theory, we could spend an entire semester talking about it and go through it word by word and ultimately try to come up with some ideas as to what the author's intent was. But in the end, it doesn't even matter what the author's intent was, because when we have the piece itself, it basically becomes public domain in the sense that we get to offer our interpretations. And our standard is that we just need to have an interpretation that's possible, not even probable. And we're using evidence from the text, so that would be quotation and paraphrase from the text in order to support our positions. We can almost think of ourselves as an attorney taking a particular position. We saw how complex a film like Citizen Kane could be. Not all films are that complex. And certainly we're seeing how complex A Sorrowful Woman could be, and that not all short stories necessarily are that complex. And we're given more foreshadowing in the story when we're told that the husband is making that sleeping medication for the woman to get instant sleep now in weekly batches. And this will be important because ultimately this will provide the means for her overdose, for her suicide at the end. Episodes such as the child pretending to be a vicious tiger. Again, the child is doing what children do. Is the child pretends, the child wants to play, and of course the woman sees that as a threat. And using the idea of a tiger works so well because the tiger is a predator. It would have a very different feeling if the child were pretending to be a puppy, let's say. So basically the child scratches the mother's wrist, a little bit more foreshadowing because slashing the wrist is oftentimes a means used for suicide. And again, the child is bringing a life to the mother, a grasshopper, and of course the mother recoils from that. She hits the child even when she knows that the father will see. This is very much a kind of cry for help, that something is wrong, because this woman doesn't know how to articulate what the problem is, and the husband doesn't know how to offer the support that she truly needs. What he offers is the perfect girl who is young, dynamic, and not pretty. In other words, this girl is not going to be a sexual threat, but the girl ends up becoming a threat nonetheless because the girl is able to perform all of the duties that the wife is unable to perform. And that said, the wife sees the girl as a threat and ultimately wants the girl fired, which is exactly what happens. Though, of course, you could think of the girl in being a completely unique situation as compared to the wife. The girl is performing a job. This is employment for which she is compensated, and she has freedom to leave or to join at any point. In the role of wife and mother, that isn't necessarily the case. And the girl moves into a white room. Think about all of the associations with white. Many positive associations: clean slate, virginal, innocent. Also, some negative associations. White can be boring. White can be very industrial. It oftentimes is the color that's used in hospitals and school systems. White gets dirty very easily. And then Eventually, after the woman fires the girl, she moves into the room. We're told that she was the former girl with all the energies. So it's very clear that the woman is trying to take on the persona of the girl. So much so that the woman is wearing an old sweater from school at this point. Of course, that's supposed to represent the woman's past when she was in school and she didn't have the responsibilities of being a wife and mother, where she didn't have other individuals that she needed to take care of. And note that she is trying on this sweater in a winter afternoon, and the story begins in a winter evening. The idea is that we are moving up in terms of time. Afternoon oftentimes has more positive associations than evening. So one might assume that perhaps something positive will be happening to the woman, not necessarily to the family, but perhaps she'll experience some sort of a epiphany or understanding. Instead, what ends up happening is that the woman isolates herself in a room, spends a lot of time hairbrushing. That's repeated. And if something is repeated, it probably has some significance. Self care is associated with hairbrushing. She's not taking care of others, she's taking care of herself. We're told at the beginning, once upon a time, there was a wife and mother one too many times. Once upon a time begins every fairy tale, which is basically what Faye and Kai's story was in Secret Sorrow. And you live happily ever after. But of course, life is more complex than a fairy tale. And I can't help but think of fairy tales in reference to hairbrushing. If you know anything about Rapunzel, and that said, we're even told that the woman was like a virgin in a tower. So there are lots of fairy tale references, but this is a fairy tale gone bad, in effect, or a fairy tale of realism, if you want to think about it that way. And don't think that this piece has not been criticized, in that ultimately this sort of a woman has responsibilities to her husband and, more importantly, to her child, which she does not fulfill. And it's hard to disagree with that. Also, the idea that ultimately, what we've got is someone who lives a very privileged life. At least it would appear so, and that she's got a supportive husband, and that she's got a healthy child, and that she's got housing, she's got disposable income, little clues such as that they go out to dinner, they can afford to hire a nanny. At the beginning, she says the laundry is now in other words, they send their laundry out. So in some ways, she should be, and many women are content. But what happens when you aren't content with whatever it is that life has offered you? And that's part of the human condition, is that we try to achieve more. It's one of the reasons why people go to school, regardless of their situation, is they want to achieve more. And what happens when a society does not offer that opportunity? That's what this particular piece is. And not only is she hairbrushing, but she's looking out a window, which signifies possibility and opportunity. Note how much of the story takes place in the house. The house is almost like a prison. How isolated this woman is, and that basically she just has her nuclear family and that girl. Really, we aren't told about other family or friends or anything of that nature. At one point, the woman decides to write poetry, a sonnet. And you may not necessarily know what a sonnet is yet. We will be studying poetry so that by the ending of the semester, you will know that a sonnet is a stylized, very formal poem, usually associated with Shakespeare sonnets, which we will talk about. And the way that a sonnet is written is very rule based. It has a certain number of lines, 14 by the way. It has a certain rhyme scheme or a rhyme pattern. And the way we determine rhyme is by looking at the last word of each line. And we identify our first rhyme with the first letter of the alphabet, which is A. And any word that ends a line that rhymes with that A word is identified as an A. And then when we have a new word that doesn't rhyme with the A, we go to the second letter of the alphabet, B, and so on and so forth. And then once we've determined what the rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern is, we determine if there's any kind of significance associated with it. Well, she's thinking about ABBA, which is not ABBA, the rock group of the 70s, but it's the rhyme pattern or the rhyme scheme. And basically, what she comes to realize is that she can have any kind of pattern, which breaks the rules of a sonnet. In fact, her poem doesn't even have to rhyme, which I think is a wonderful symbol for what she is experiencing, in that this woman is contemplating all of the rules of wife and mother that she has to follow and beginning to realize that she doesn't have to follow those particular rules. As the isolation continues, the family is putting notes under the door, which seems very unrealistic unless we want to think about Emily Dickinson's biography, which we will talk about, where she very much isolated herself from individuals. But nevertheless, the woman is in the room, and now it's spring, and spring signifies renewal and rebirth. It's also the morning time. So one would assume at this point in the story that the woman is experiencing some sort of rejuvenation, that there's going to be some sort of epiphany or some sort of positive event for the woman. It may not necessarily be positive for the family, but it would be positive for the woman, as she realizes that those joyful notes that she's receiving are suffocating her. More foreshadowing, suffocation is another way to commit suicide. And then one of the more important quotes in the story, she went to the cupboard and took what was hers. Very easy to miss this quote, but basically what's in the cupboard, as we are told earlier in the story, is the sleeping medication, which the husband is making in weekly batches at this point. And she completes many chores by the ending of the story to illustrate that certainly she is capable. It sounds like a laundry list, in effect. And the family is delighted, the husband and the child, because ultimately what this means is that mommy is, quote, well, unquote. The wife is, quote, well, unquote, in that she's fulfilling the expectations of society. And the question the author wants us to ask is, does that really signify being, quote, well, unquote, at least for an individual? And even though that might support a family or might support a societal structure. And out of the mouths of babes, as they say, in that the child says something that's very, very telling. And of course, the child is only 3. So the child doesn't really understand. Certainly, the child doesn't understand that his mother's committed suicide at the end. He asks at the end, can we eat the turkey? But what the child does understand when he sees the woman is that he says, quote, she's tired from doing all our things again, which is really what there was once upon a time, a wife and mother, one too many times. The husband checks the vitals. This is why he's checking the wrist, the chest, the eyes, the child not understanding that's what's happening. And then the husband puts his face in her freshly washed hair. In other words, she's experiencing grief. And of course, one of the last things she does is self-care for herself. And this laundry list of items can, in fact, perhaps accommodate the family for the first week, maybe couple of weeks of her absence. So that's another way of sort of viewing her performance of tasks. But that performance of tasks illustrates that it's not that she's incapable of doing it. She's quite capable. Is that it doesn't bring her satisfaction. And what do you do when you're looking for self-satisfaction? And again, you could walk away from the story really disliking this woman and thinking of her as quite selfish. But that was not the intent of the author, and that's a distinction, that the author wants us to see the woman's perspective and wonder what happens when once upon a time there's a wife and mother one too many times. What happens if you are trapped in a situation that doesn't afford you lots of opportunity? Because at the time period, divorce was taboo. At the time period, it was much more difficult for female to earn her own income and support herself. So it was a very different world. And that piece is not only in contrast to A Secret Sorrow, which was very formulaic, but I think serves as a nice contrast to The Story of an Hour, which was another short story, very short, only about a page and a half or so long, that I had offered you. And I've included links whenever possible for the pieces that we're doing, and thus far I've been able to find links for all of the pieces of literature that we've been finding. And this piece was written in 1894, so we're talking about a piece that was written many, many decades earlier, yet shares many similarities, interestingly. Now, the textbook talks about the story of an hour. It uses it as an example of how to go through a text and read it for analysis, and how to take notes, how to annotate the text, and to ask questions about the text, and journal, write down some reflections about the text. But I wanted us to talk about this particular text from an analytic standpoint. The author is Kate Chopin, and if you know anything about Kate Chopin, another feminist writer, but being a feminist writer in the 1800s was very different than being a feminist writer in the 1970s. So this was unusual in and of itself. And Kate Chopin is considered to be part of that literary canon that scholars and critics think, are worthy of academic study. And that said, knowing Gail Godwin's background when she was writing A Sorrowful Woman, PhD in English, I'm sure she knew the story of an hour and was influenced by it. So basically, Gail Godwin's 1971 story was likely informed by the story of an hour, inspired, if you will. And it's true of all artists. You can appreciate a musician and the song that they've created, but if you really want to be a super fan of that musician, you will know and learn about the other musicians that influenced your particular musician, and ultimately all of that comes together. And it's the same with authors. Authors are inspired by the authors that come previously. Kate Chopin is probably best known for a novella. Remember, we were talking about a novella, something that is shorter than a novel but longer than a short story. And the novella is entitled The Awakening, which led to the ending of Kate Chopin's career, believe it or not, because it was considered so scandalous. It was about a woman experiencing an awakening in her marriage. And not only does she leave her husband and child in the 1800s and set up her own residence, she has an affair and feels guilty, not because she's cheating on her husband, but because she's having an affair with one man and she'd prefer to have an affair with another. Those are just some of the elements. There are even more scandalous elements in the piece. So that led to basically the ending of Kate Chopin's career. But the story of an hour is a wonderful example of how less is more, that length does not necessarily determine quality. Keep that in mind when you're thinking about writing a paper, by the way. And we are given literally the story of an hour with a Mrs. Mallard. And this is important that she's first referenced as Mrs. Mallard. She isn't given a first name. So in this particular instance, we don't have identity because she is referred to only by surname, husband's surname, which is still convention even in 2026. And that said, think about how the term Mrs. denotes marital status, as does Miss, in the way that a term like Mr. does not, which is why Ms. was created in the 70s, no less. So the idea here is that she's seen as an entity belonging to her husband. And eventually we're told her name, which is Louise, and we're also told her sister's name. One assumes because we're given the sister's first name that means she has a level of autonomy. Perhaps she's not married in the way that her Mrs. Mallard is. But nevertheless, both names, Josephine and Louise, have male roots. Louise, Louis, Josephine, Joseph, to illustrate a society of male dominance, perhaps, and the idea of how male is given voice and autonomy in a way that female is not. And we're told at the very beginning that she has heart trouble, which is different than what we're told at the ending, which is heart disease. And while you could use the term synonymously, they have different connotations or associations. That heart trouble suggests something emotional, a troubled heart, which leads to the question is why would Mrs. Mallard's heart be troubled? And it seems it has something to do with her marriage based on the story that we're given. As opposed to heart disease, which suggests something more physical, physiological. And this is what everyone assumes occurs to her as she's told that her husband has died in a terrible accident, and she isolates herself, begins to grieve, and then transitions over to beginning to even celebrate the idea of the possibilities afforded to her as a widow. And since we aren't told about children, one assumes that she's going to inherit the estate, which means that she would be in a financially comfortable enough situation that she would not need to remarry. She could remarry, but she wouldn't necessarily need to do so as an economic necessity, which was oftentimes the function of marriage for female during this time period. Perhaps explaining why, though it's a complicated issue, why there was a much lower rate of female remarrying upon widowhood during this time period than male remarrying in widowhood during this time period. But nevertheless, after she leaves the room, she is encountering what appears to be her husband, who was supposed to be dead, but it was all a terrible error. She sees Brentley Mallard. Notice that Brentley is given a first name right at the very beginning because he's given identity. It was just a terrible mistake. And of course, we can speculate as to how that mistake was made, but the author doesn't really want us to, or else we would have been given that information in this very short story. All we know is that Richards, Brentley's friend, gives the news, and while we could speculate as to the motivations and reasons why Richards could have made such a mistake, that's not the intent of the story, and we're not going to be able to find any evidence outside of speculation. What we are going to find, though, is Mrs. Mallard's, who is now Louise. Notice that there's a transition to her first name in the middle of the story when she begins to contemplate being a widow and no longer having to deal with the ties of marriage. When Louise realizes she's going to have to return to being a Mrs. Mallard, to being a wife at the very least. We're not told about her being a mother, so we should just assume that she's not. And that means she's going to lose all of that autonomy. And she dies of what others say is heart disease, but we know it's really more about heart trouble, specifically of joy that kills, quote unquote. And while everybody thinks that she dies of happiness and relief that she sees her husband, we know that it's much more complex than that. And that, yes, she loved him sometimes. And if you've ever loved somebody sometimes, you know exactly how that's possible, how you can have conflicting feelings. And also, the husband is referenced as somebody who loved her and was kind and gentle. He had kind and gentle hands, never saved look but love upon her. And the idea is that it's not so much about the husband and more about the institution of marriage. So, one of my favorite lines in the story really broadens the understanding of the story because we usually talk about it as a story that discusses the repressive role of marriage for female. But we're told that there was no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And one of the reasons why I love this line is because it broadens the text to outside of her experience and outside of the female experience to the institution of marriage as a whole. That in marriage, two individuals try to impose power upon one another. And of course, marriage is a sociological institution. So, that said, we know that she goes from thinking about spring days and summer days, and we know that references to time periods and to seasons oftentimes have symbolic significance. So, in this instance, spring and summer are portrayed very positively. And there are all kinds of symbols of freedom throughout this piece. The open window. A window is usually viewed as something that's expansive, that leads to the outside world, especially if it's open. The roomy armchair, the idea that she's comfortable, she's not confined, and an armchair is designed for one person, not two. The open square that she sees outside the window, again, this sense of openness. Growth. Spring, which is the time of growth and renewal. References to sparrows. Note that Mrs. Mallard's surname is of a bird, a duck, mallard. In this instance, we are given a name as opposed to our previous text where we were just told about wife and mother and husband and child. But if you think about bird imagery, which Chopin oftentimes uses in her text, females can represent birds. In fact, it was oftentimes a slang term to reference a female as a bird. Birds can be entrapped, such as in a cage, but birds can also spread their wings and fly, which is what Louise is now seeing with the sparrows. But I would argue that using the term mallard, in fact, in my face-to-face class, we oftentimes do a little bit of research about mallards and how that might be applicable to understanding why the author might have chosen this surname. And yes, the author might say, well, this is my maiden name, for instance, but nevertheless, regardless of any personal reasons, we do know that it seems to be appropriate that she's referencing a common duck, because we could argue that Mrs. Mallard's situation might be a common one. And the idea that the male mallards are much more colorful than the females, in other words, they're the ones who are given more attention, might perhaps reinforce the idea of a male-dominated society in the 1800s. And the idea that they mate for life, however, the male is sometimes known to stray. And that too could be applicable to this particular story. Because now there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women, again, this goes to marriage, believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So we know that also she's watching the rain. Now, rain can be negative, but it can also be positive, that rain can lead to cleansing, which is what water does, renewal. That's one of the reasons why we have so much rain in the spring. And that ultimately blue skies are peeking forth. So if you don't like the idea of rain as a positive, certainly the blue sky is a positive. Even the direction that she's talking about the clouds are in the west, very deliberate choice. The author could have chosen the north, the south, the east, the west. Some associations with west. If you think about the idea of sun setting in the west, this might be the beginning of an ending for her, the setting of something. And of course, when the sun sets, we expect it to rise. So, of course, this could also suggest that after the west will be the possibility of a rising, or after the descent, there will be a possibility of rising for Louise with her new life, where she no longer has to be reduced to being a Mrs. Mallard. And all of these symbols are very deliberately chosen to reinforce the theme. Even something like saying there was a peddler outside crying his wares, which is one of my favorite lines, because crying is usually associated with something negative. And though when you can cry out something to sell something, that could be much more positive. There's a sense of hope and opportunity with that. And taking the line where she says, free, 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 body and soul, free. It's pretty easy to indicate that she feels, well, free. And you could use this quotation to illustrate that fact. And keep in mind what I'm paid to do, which is basically to take the opposite viewpoint of whatever it is you're saying in your paper. And what you're talking about is not a fact, but you're talking about analysis, something that could be debated. So you could say in your paper that Mrs. Mallard feels free. My responsibility is to take the opposite position and say, no, she doesn't, even though I've already talked about it in class. And your responsibility, much like a good attorney, is to talk about the ways in which Mrs. Mallard feels free. And in fact, you could even quote Mrs. Mallard saying, free, 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 body and soul free, which is a great quote to illustrate that she feels free. And your position doesn't even have to be correct. It just needs to be, and not even probable, it just needs to be possible. So it would be very difficult to argue that she doesn't feel free when she actually says it out loud that she feels free. And we're told that she felt something creeping towards her. There's a lot of negative associations with creeping. This is not necessarily something she initially wants. We're told that she's young, but she's repressed, which leads to the question, what is it that's repressed her? And the only information we're given is about her marriage. So the assumption is that marriage is the repressive force, which is a similar theme to what we saw with our previous story. However, she thinks about spring days and summer days, again, hope and optimism, now that she's not going to be repressed. And the idea that she's young, because usually we associate heart disease or heart trouble with someone who's older, but the fact that she's young just again reinforces this idea that her heart problems are more than just something that is physiological, and that she has an opportunity to think that she would, quote, live for herself, unquote, and then that's taken from her. So the joy that kills at the end is much more complex. Yes, she probably felt a certain level of relief and perhaps even joy. I mean, she loved him sometimes. He had kind, gentle hands. But we also know, because we were in the room with her, the way the other characters weren't, we also know that she's also going to feel sadness, and she's also going to feel loss over the fact that her husband is alive, which means that she has to return to her life of repression. So the third story that I wanted to talk very briefly about, because I'm cognizant of the time, is A Rose for Emily. And I've got some notes below about A Rose for Emily, which we will talk about next class. But basically, since I've been highlighting some important quotes, I thought without my direction, you could highlight an important quote. So that's going to be today's attendance question for our class, and this will be due on Saturday the 21st. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. And of course, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are highly encouraged to do so. You are required, however, to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you a good idea of what we would have talked about in our class discussion. So, your question for today's attendance is identify an important quote from A Rose for Emily, and why you think it is important. That's really the piece that's of interest to me. Why do you think that quote is important or has some significance? So I'm assuming everyone's going to be choosing rather different quotes, or in one way or another, you're going to get a good overview of many of the important quotes in the story, so that when I pick up next class and I finish talking about the story of an hour, I just have a couple more points to make. We can move into Rose for Emily, which is a challenging piece for a number of reasons that we will discuss. And also, A Rose for Emily is followed by a brief interview by the author, William Faulkner, where he talks a little bit about his thinking. So I wanted us to discuss his interview. The stories that are coming up: Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, Battle Royal. And we also need to start talking a little bit more about paper number 1, which isn't going to be due until the midpoint in the semester, but now we've got a film and as well as several short stories, and we will continue to have more from which you could choose for writing your paper. So this is the time to begin thinking about what might you want to write your paper about, though certainly we have other short stories coming up. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about short story. Take care. Bye-bye.